The summer of 2019 was supposed to be different. After 15 years of playing in small bars, wedding halls, and birthday parties, finally got the call he had been waiting for his entire adult life. The Riverside Arts Festival wanted him to open their Saturday night show. 3,000 people, a real stage, real lights, the kind of opportunity that comes once in a lifetime if it comes at all. Was 34 years old. He had started playing piano when he was 6, taught by his grandmother in her tiny apartment in the Bronx. She had an old upright piano that was missing 2 keys and always sounded slightly out of tune. But to Young, it was the most beautiful instrument in the world. He would sit on that creaky bench for hours, his small fingers stumbling over the keys while his grandmother hummed along from the kitchen. She passed away when he was 19. The day after her funeral made a promise to himself. He would become a professional musician. He would play on stages she could only dream about. He would make her proud. But dreams are stubborn things. They don't come easy and they don't come fast. For the next 15 years, worked as a piano teacher during the day and played gigs at night. He formed a trio with 2 friends he met at a music workshop. Williams played the drums. He was a quiet man with a big laugh and even bigger talent. Handled the bass. She was sharp, funny, and could hold a groove like nobody else had ever played with. The 3 of them called themselves the Sunday Collective. They played jazz mostly, but they weren't afraid to mix in some soul, some blues, whatever felt right in the moment. They weren't famous. They weren't rich. But they had something special when they played together. You could feel it in the room. Even in a half-empty bar at 2 in the morning, their music made people stop talking and just listen. The call from the Riverside Festival came on a Tuesday afternoon in June. Was in the middle of teaching a 12-year-old boy how to play scales when his phone buzzed. He ignored it at first. Then it buzzed again. And again. When the lesson ended, he checked his messages and nearly dropped his phone. The festival organizers had seen a video of the Sunday Collective performing at a small club in Brooklyn. Someone had posted it online, and it had gotten some attention. They wanted the trio to open for the headliner on Saturday night. They would have 30 minutes on the main stage. They would be paid more than they usually made in 3 months of gigs combined. Called first. There was silence on the other end of the line for almost 10 seconds, then started laughing. It was the kind of laugh that comes from deep in your chest, the kind you can't fake. Screamed so loud when she heard the news that had to hold the phone away from his ear. The next 4 days were a blur of rehearsals, planning, and barely sleeping. They decided to open with one of his original compositions, a piece called Sunday Morning Light. It was a gentle melody, the kind of song that made you think of lazy weekends and warm coffee and the feeling of sunlight coming through a window. Had written it for his wife on their 5th wedding anniversary. It was personal. It was vulnerable. It was perfect. Was the one who had kept going through all the hard years. She worked as a nurse at a hospital downtown, pulling long shifts to help pay the bills while chased a dream that sometimes felt impossible. She never complained. She never told him to give up and get a real job. She believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. They had a daughter together, was 7 years old and had her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn spirit. She had already started taking piano lessons, sitting on the same bench where practiced, her tiny fingers trying to copy the movements of his hands. She wanted to be just like her dad when she grew up. On the night of the festival, and arrived early to get a spot near the front of the stage. Had made a sign out of cardboard and markers. It said, "Play your heart out, Daddy," in big, colorful letters. She held it above her head, bouncing with excitement, while tried to keep her from running off into the crowd. Backstage, the energy was electric. Stood in front of a small mirror, adjusting his collar for the 10th time. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from something else entirely. Anticipation. Joy. The overwhelming sense that everything he had worked for was about to come together in one perfect moment. Sat in the corner, twirling his drumsticks between his fingers. He had a calm expression on his face, but knew him well enough to see the excitement underneath. Was packing back and forth, muttering the bass line to herself, her fingers moving in the air like she was already playing. A stagehand poked his head through the door. 5 minutes, he said. Took a deep breath. He thought about his grandmother. He thought about all the nights playing to empty rooms. He thought about and waiting for him out there in the crowd. This was it. This was the moment. The three of them gathered in a small circle like they always did before a show. They didn't say anything. They just looked at each other and nodded. 15 years of friendship. 15 years of shared struggle. It all came down to the next 30 minutes. They walked out onto the stage. The crowd was massive, had never seen so many people in one place before. The lights were bright and hot, washing everything in a golden glow. He could hear the murmur of thousands of voices, the rustle of movement, the distant sound of music from another stage. The air smelled like summer, like grass and food vendors and possibility. He sat down at the grand piano. It was beautiful, a glossy black that probably cost more than everything owned put together. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys, feeling their smooth weight. This was real. This was actually happening. He looked out into the crowd and found face. She was smiling, holding on her shoulders so their daughter could see, was waving her sign frantically, felt his heart swell in his chest. Behind him, settled onto his drum throne, plugged in her bass and gave him a thumbs up. The stage manager's voice crackled through the monitor. "You're on." Placed his hands on the keys. The first notes of Sunday Morning Light floated out into the night air, soft and sweet and full of hope. The crowd grew quiet. 3,000 people, all of them listening, all of them present in this single, beautiful moment. Nobody knew that beneath the stage, something was terribly wrong. A gas line, old and poorly maintained, had developed a small crack earlier that day. The leak was slow and silent, invisible to everyone. The gas had been collecting in the enclosed space beneath the wooden platform for hours, mixing with the air, waiting for something to ignite it. Above played on, lost in the music, swayed gently within her arms, closed his eyes feeling the rhythm, smiled, her fingers dancing along the strings. They had no idea that in less than 3 minutes, their lives would change forever. The melody continued, easy and warm, floating over a crowd that had no reason to be afraid. Not yet. The first notes of Sunday Morning Light drifted across the festival grounds like something you could almost touch. Fingers moved across the piano keys with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man so nervous just moments before. But that was the thing about music. Once it started, everything else disappeared. The crowd, the lights, the pressure, all of it melted away, and there was only the sound. In the front row, felt tears forming in her eyes. She had heard this song hundreds of times, had played it for her on their anniversary, late at night in their small apartment while slept in the next room. But hearing it now, with 3,000 people listening, was something else entirely. It was like watching a secret part of her husband's soul being shared with the world. Had stopped bouncing. The 7-year-old was completely still on her mother's shoulders, her cardboard sign hanging loosely in her small hands. She was watching her father with wide eyes, the way children watch magic tricks, like she was seeing something impossible and wonderful at the same time. Behind began to add a soft rhythm on the drums, just brushes on the snare at first, a gentle whisper of sound that blended with the piano like two voices having a quiet conversation. He had his eyes closed, his head nodding slightly with each beat. 15 years of playing together had created something between the three musicians that went beyond practice or skill. They could feel each other's movements without looking. They breathed together. They listened together. They were one instrument with 3 parts. Came in next on the bass. Her notes were low and warm like a heartbeat underneath the melody. She was smiling, her eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance, completely lost in the music. This was what she lived for. Not the money, not the recognition, just this feeling. This connection between sound and silence, between the 3 of them and the thousands of strangers watching in the summer night. The crowd had gone quiet. That was the thing about good music. It didn't demand attention. It earned it. People who had been talking fell silent. Couples who had been looking at their phones put them away. A group of teenagers who had come to see the headliner later that night found themselves unexpectedly moved by this opening act they had never heard of before. About 50 feet from the stage, an older man named Harold Vega stood alone near a food vendor. He was 67 years old, a retired firefighter who had spent 40 years running into danger while everyone else ran away. He had seen things in his career that still visited him in his dreams. Burns and collapses and moments when seconds meant the difference between life and death. He had come to the festival tonight because his daughter had given him tickets for his birthday, insisting that he needed to get out of the house more often. Harold wasn't much of a music person. He didn't know anything about jazz or piano or the difference between a good bassist and a great one. But standing there in the crowd, listening to Sunday Morning Light, he felt something shift inside his chest. The melody was simple, almost childlike in its sweetness. It reminded him of Sunday mornings when his kids were young, before they grew up and moved away, before his wife passed and left him alone in a house full of memories. He closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. On the other side of the crowd, a young couple named Victor and held hands, swaying gently to the rhythm. They had been together for 2 years and were still in that phase where every moment felt special just because they were sharing it. Leaned her head against Victor's shoulder. Victor pulled her a little closer. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. A few rows back, a teenage girl named sat on a blanket with her parents. She had complained the entire drive to the festival, angry that she was missing a party at her friend's house. Her arms were crossed, her expression bored and annoyed. But as the song continued, something changed. She uncrossed her arms. She stopped looking at her phone. For the first time all night, she actually listened. The music built slowly, layer by layer, like a house being constructed one brick at a time. Added complexity to the melody, his right hand dancing through runs and improvisations while his left hand held down the foundation. The sound grew richer, fuller, more alive. It was like watching a flower bloom in fast motion, each petal opening to reveal something more beautiful underneath. Backstage, a technician named Danny Park was making his rounds. He was 29 years old, responsible for monitoring the pyrotechnics and special effects equipment that would be used during the headliner's set later that night. It was routine work. Check the connections, verify the timers, make sure everything was ready for the big show. He walked past the piano trios area, barely paying attention to the music. He had a checklist to complete and a timeline to follow. The festival organizers were demanding, and Danny had learned long ago that the best way to keep his job was to be invisible and efficient. He was halfway to the pyrotechnics panel when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A faint hissing, like air escaping from a tire, coming from somewhere beneath the stage. He stopped walking and tilted his head, trying to locate the source. At first, he thought it might be a speaker cable or a ventilation issue. The stage was built on a temporary platform, raised about 4 feet off the ground to accommodate the wiring and equipment underneath. There were dozens of possible explanations for a strange sound. Most of them were harmless. But then he smelled it. The odor was faint at first, almost lost in the mix of food vendors and summer air. But it was there, sharp and unnatural, the kind of smell that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up even before your brain understood why. Danny's stomach dropped. He had worked enough festivals to know what that smell meant. Gas. He moved quickly toward the side of the stage, pulling his radio from his belt. His mind was racing through possibilities. A propane leak from one of the cooking vendors. No, they were too far away. A problem with the generator fuel lines. Possible, but they used diesel, and this smelled different. He dropped to his knees and looked under the edge of the platform. It was dark beneath the stage, a maze of cables and support beams and shadows. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning the space. That's when he saw it. A thin line of corrosion running along one of the old gas pipes that fed the heating system from the venue's permanent infrastructure. The pipe shouldn't have been active. The system was supposed to be shut off during summer events, but someone had made a mistake. Someone had forgotten to close a valve, and now gas was pooling in the enclosed space beneath 3,000 pounds of staging equipment. Danny grabbed his radio. His hands were shaking. "Control, this is Danny. We have a serious problem. I'm seeing a gas leak under the main stage. We need to evacuate immediately. Do you copy?" Static crackled back at him. "Control, do you copy? This is urgent. We need to stop the show and clear the area now." More static, then a voice distant and distorted. "Say again, we didn't catch that." Danny opened his mouth to repeat the warning, but he never got the chance. Above him on the stage was reaching the climax of Sunday Morning Light. The melody swelled to its peak, filling the night air with beauty. Lifted her hand to wipe a tear from her cheek. Whispered "Daddy" with pure wonder in her voice. 3,000 people held their breath, suspended in a moment of perfect harmony. None of them heard the hissing. None of them smelled the gas. None of them saw the tiny spark that jumped from a faulty electrical connection beneath the stage. The explosion came without warning. 1 second there was music, the next there was only light and sound and chaos. A wall of force erupted from beneath the platform, tearing through wood and metal like paper. The piano flew apart. The lights collapsed. The air itself seemed to catch fire. And in that terrible instant, everything changed. The easy melody was gone. In its place, there was only screaming. The world turned upside down in less than a second. One moment, there was music and starlight and the peaceful hum of 3,000 people enjoying a summer night. The next moment, there was nothing but fire and noise and confusion. Felt himself lifted off the piano bench like a leaf caught in a hurricane. He didn't understand what was happening. His brain couldn't process it. One instant he was playing the final notes of Sunday Morning Light, feeling the music flow through his fingers like water. The next instant he was flying through the air, surrounded by heat and light and the terrible sound of things breaking apart. He hit the ground hard. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs and sent pain shooting through his entire body. He tried to move, tried to understand where he was, but everything was spinning. Smoke filled his eyes and throat. His ears were ringing so loud that he couldn't hear anything else. Through the haze, he saw shapes moving, people running, flames dancing in places where flames shouldn't be. The stage, the beautiful stage he had dreamed about for 15 years, was gone. In its place was a twisted mess of wood and metal and sparks. He tried to call out for, but his voice wouldn't work. It was like screaming underwater. Nothing came out except a weak, broken sound that disappeared into the chaos around him. 50 feet away, Harold Vega was already moving. The explosion had knocked him backward, but 40 years of training had taken over before he even hit the ground. He rolled, absorbed the impact, and was back on his feet in seconds. His ears were ringing. His shoulder ached where he had landed on it. None of that mattered. He had spent his entire career running toward danger while everyone else ran away. Tonight was no different. The crowd was in panic. People were pushing and shoving, trying to get away from the burning stage. Some were screaming. Others were crying. A few just stood frozen, too shocked to move, their minds unable to accept what their eyes were seeing. Harold pushed against the flow of bodies, moving toward the flames instead of away from them. He could see people on the ground near the stage. Some were moving, some were not. Every second mattered. He knew that better than anyone. The first person he reached was a young woman, maybe 20 years old, lying on her back with her eyes open and dazed. A piece of debris had knocked her down, but she didn't seem seriously hurt. Harold grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet. "Can you walk?" he shouted over the noise. She nodded, still looking confused. "Then walk that way, away from here. Go now." She stumbled off into the crowd. and Harold turned back toward the stage. Near the front row was on the ground with pressed beneath her. When the explosion happened, her first instinct had been to protect her daughter. She had thrown herself over the little girl, shielding her from the debris and heat with her own body. It was the kind of thing mothers do without thinking, the kind of love that doesn't ask questions or calculate risks. Was crying, could feel her daughter's small body shaking beneath her, but she was alive. That was all that mattered. "It's okay, baby," whispered, even though nothing was okay. "Mommy's here, mommy's got you." She tried to lift her head and look for her, but the smoke was too thick. She couldn't see the stage anymore. She couldn't see anything except shadows and flames and the terrified faces of people running past her. A hand grabbed her shoulder. She flinched, ready to fight, ready to protect from whatever new danger was coming. But it was just a man, an older man with gray hair and kind eyes, kneeling beside her in the chaos. "Are you hurt?" Harold asked. Shook her head. "My daughter, please help my daughter." "She's going to be fine. You both are, but we need to move. Can you stand?" Nodded. She gathered in her arms and let Harold help her to her feet. The little girl was still crying, her face buried in her mother's neck, the cardboard sign that said, "Play your heart out, Daddy," lying forgotten in the dirt. "My husband," said, her voice breaking. "He was on the stage. Please, I have to find him." Harold looked toward the burning wreckage. His heart sank. Anyone who had been on that stage when it exploded would need a miracle to survive. But he had seen miracles before. He had pulled people from places where nobody should have lived. Hope was stubborn that way. "Get your daughter to safety first," he said. "The medical tents are that way. I'll look for your husband." Hesitated. Every part of her wanted to run toward the flames to know if he was alive or dead. But she had in her arms. She had to think about her daughter first. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and turned away from the stage. Harold watched her go for just a moment. Then he moved toward the fire. On the other side of the wreckage, Williams was trying to stand. The explosion had thrown him off his drum throne and into a pile of collapsed equipment. His left arm hung at a strange angle, clearly broken. His face was covered in small cuts from flying debris. Every breath hurt. But he was alive. He looked around, trying to find. They had been so close together on the stage. She had been right there, just a few feet away, smiling as she played the bass. Where was she now? He shouted, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Where are you?" No answer. He stumbled forward, using his good arm to push aside pieces of broken wood and twisted metal. The heat was intense. He could feel it on his skin, warning him to stay back. But he couldn't leave without finding her. Then he saw it, a hand sticking out from beneath a fallen lighting rig, small and delicate, with calluses on the fingertips from years of playing bass. Dropped to his knees beside her. "Hold on, I'm going to get you out." He tried to lift the metal beam with his one good arm, but it was too heavy. The pain in his broken arm screamed at him every time he moved. He pulled anyway. He pushed. He begged the metal to move with everything he had. It wouldn't budge. "Help," he screamed into the chaos. "Somebody help me, there's someone trapped here." For a terrible moment, nobody came. Everyone was running the other way, away from the flames, away from the danger. Was alone with his friend buried under debris, and he couldn't save her by himself. Then a figure emerged from the smoke, the older man with gray hair, Harold. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He just grabbed the other end of the beam and nodded at. "On three," Harold said. "1, 2, 3. They lifted together. The metal groaned and shifted. It wasn't much, just a few inches, but it was enough. Reached under with his good arm and pulled free, dragging her away from the wreckage as Harold let the beam drop. Was unconscious. Her back was burned, her clothes torn, but she was breathing. Could see her chest rising and falling, and that small movement was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "She needs medical help," Harold said. There are paramedics setting up near the entrance. Can you carry her? Looked at his broken arm, then at the pain didn't matter. Nothing mattered except getting her to safety. I can carry her, he said. He lifted her as gently as he could, cradling her against his chest, and started walking toward the lights in the distance. Harold watched him go. Then he turned back toward the flames one more time. Somewhere in that wreckage, there was still a piano player who hadn't been found, a husband, a father, a man whose music had filled the night with beauty just minutes before everything fell apart. Harold didn't know if was alive. He didn't know if anyone could survive what had happened to that stage, but he was going to look anyway. Because that's what you do. You don't give up on people. You don't stop searching. You keep going until there's nobody left to save. The sirens were getting closer now. Red and blue lights flickered in the distance. Help was coming. But for some people, help was already too late. And for others, the nightmare was just beginning. The news spread faster than the fire itself. Within an hour, every television station in the country was showing footage of the Riverside Arts Festival disaster. Shaky videos captured the moment of the explosion, the wall of flame erupting from beneath the stage, the chaos that followed. Reporters stood in front of yellow caution tape, speaking in serious voices about casualties and investigations and questions that nobody could answer yet. 14 people died that night. 61 were injured. Some would recover fully. Others would carry the scars for the rest of their lives. Was pulled from the wreckage by Harold Vega just minutes before the firefighters arrived. He was unconscious, his body covered in burns and cuts, his right hand crushed beneath a fallen support beam. Harold had found him near where the piano used to be, lying face down in the debris, barely breathing. The paramedics worked on him right there on the ground, stabilizing him before loading him into an ambulance. Harold stood nearby, watching, his own hands shaking for the first time that night. He had saved 7 people in the chaos, 7 strangers who would go home to their families because a retired firefighter happened to be in the crowd. But he couldn't save everyone. Nobody could. Arrived at the hospital 3 hours after the explosion. She had taken to her sister's house first, making sure the little girl was safe and surrounded by family before racing across the city to find her husband. The drive felt like it took forever. Every red light, every slow car, every second that passed was torture. When she finally found room, a doctor was waiting outside. His expression told her everything she needed to know before he said a single word. "Your husband is alive," the doctor said, "but his injuries are serious." Had second-degree burns across his back and shoulders. Several ribs were broken. His left leg was fractured in 2 places, but the worst damage was to his right hand. The bones had been shattered so badly that the surgeons couldn't repair them. They had done everything possible, but the nerves were destroyed. He would never regain full function. Listened to the words, but her mind couldn't accept them. Hands were everything to him. They were how he spoke to the world, how he expressed the feelings he could never put into words. Without his hands, who would he be? She walked into his room and sat beside his bed. He was unconscious, connected to machines that beeped and hummed in the quiet darkness. His right hand was wrapped in thick bandages, hidden from view like something shameful. Took his left hand in hers and held it gently. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Down the hall was in the intensive care unit. The burns on her back were severe, covering nearly 30% of her body. The doctors had put her into a medically induced coma to help her body heal. Sat in the waiting room outside her door, his broken arm in a cast, refusing to leave. He had called his parents in California. They were on a plane now, flying across the country to be with their daughter, had promised to stay until they arrived. He had promised to be there when she woke up. He didn't know if she would wake up. The doctors wouldn't give him a straight answer, but he wasn't going to break his promise. The police investigation began before the sun came up. Detectives interviewed witnesses, examined the wreckage, and collected evidence from the scene. They found Danny Park sitting alone on a bench near the parking lot, still in shock, still holding the radio that had failed to work when it mattered most. Danny told them everything: the hissing sound, the smell of gas, the frantic calls for help that went unanswered. He showed them the corroded pipe, the faulty valve, the electrical connection that had sparked the explosion. He answered every question honestly, even though he knew the answers would lead to hard truths. The investigation revealed a pattern of negligence that went back years. The gas line beneath the stage was part of an old heating system that should have been decommissioned long ago. Inspectors had flagged it as a potential hazard multiple times, but the festival organizers had ignored the warnings. Proper maintenance would have cost money. Shutting down the venue for repairs would have cost even more. So they had done nothing, hoping the problem would never become serious. That hope killed 14 people. The festival's director, a man named Gregory, was arrested 2 weeks after the disaster. He was charged with criminal negligence and involuntary manslaughter. Prosecutors said he had known about the safety issues and had deliberately concealed them to keep the festival running. He had signed off on fake inspection reports. He had overruled his own safety team when they raised concerns. Gregory would eventually be convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. But no amount of jail time could bring back the people who died. No verdict could undo the damage that had been done. Woke up 3 days after the explosion. The first thing he saw was face, tired and worried, watching him from the chair beside his bed. The first thing he felt was pain, dull and constant, spreading through every part of his body. The first thing he tried to do was move his right hand. It wouldn't respond. He looked down at the bandages, at the fingers that had once danced across piano keys with perfect precision. He tried again. Nothing. The hand was there, but it wasn't his anymore. It was just dead weight attached to his arm. The doctors did everything they could, said softly. The nerve damage was too severe. Didn't say anything. He just stared at his hand, at the thing that used to be his hand, and felt something break inside him that had nothing to do with bones. In the weeks that followed, barely spoke. He went through physical therapy in silence, learning to walk again with a leg that ached with every step. He sat through counseling sessions, nodding at the therapist's questions without really answering them. He came home to his apartment and sat in the living room, staring at the piano that gathered dust in the corner. Didn't understand why her father was so different now. She would climb onto his lap and ask him to play for her, the way he used to before the accident. Would look at the piano, then look at his damaged hand, then look away without saying anything. After a while, stopped asking. Tried to hold the family together. She worked double shifts at the hospital to cover the medical bills that kept arriving. She made dinner every night, even when wouldn't eat. She told stories about happy times, trying to keep some light alive in a home that felt darker every day. But she was struggling too. She had nightmares about the explosion, about the moment she threw herself over, about the heat and the screaming and the terrible not knowing that followed. She would wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, and reach for beside her. Sometimes he was there. Sometimes he had gotten up to sit alone in the dark, lost in thoughts he wouldn't share. Woke from her coma after 5 weeks. The burns on her back would require years of surgeries and skin grafts. She would never be free of pain completely, but she was alive, and that was more than anyone had expected. Was there when she opened her eyes. He had kept his promise. "Hey," he said, his voice cracking. "Welcome back." Tried to smile. It hurt too much, so she just reached out and took his hand instead. They didn't talk about the music. Not yet. That conversation would come later when they were stronger, when the wounds weren't so fresh. For now, it was enough just to be alive, just to be together. Back in his apartment, sat alone at 2 in the morning, staring at the piano he could no longer play. He thought about his grandmother, about the promise he had made at her funeral. He thought about, and still fighting to recover. He thought about the 14 people who would never fight again. He thought about the easy melody, the one he had written for, the one that was playing when the world exploded. And for the first time since the accident, cried. Not because of the pain, not because of the hand he had lost, but because he didn't know who he was supposed to be anymore. The man who played piano was gone, and he had no idea what was left. 6 months passed, then a year. The news cameras moved on to other tragedies, other stories, other headlines that would capture attention for a few days before being forgotten. But for the people who had been at the Riverside Arts Festival that summer night, time moved differently. Some days felt like years, some moments stretched on forever. Spent most of that first year in a kind of fog. He went through the motions of living without really being alive. He ate when put food in front of him. He slept when his body couldn't stay awake anymore. He sat in therapy sessions and said the things he thought he was supposed to say, but inside he felt hollow, empty, like someone had scooped out everything that made him who he was and left only a shell behind. The piano sat untouched in the corner of the living room, had offered to move it, to put it in storage so wouldn't have to look at it every day. He had refused. He didn't know why. Maybe he wasn't ready to let go completely. Maybe some small part of him still hoped for a miracle that would never come. Turned 8, then 9. She grew taller. She started 3rd grade. She made new friends and learned new things and slowly, carefully, stopped asking her father to play music for her. Children are adaptable that way. They learn to work around the broken places in their world, building new paths when the old ones are blocked. But she never forgot the sound of her father's piano. Late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she would sometimes sneak into the living room and sit on the bench just looking at the keys. She was afraid to touch them. They felt sacred somehow, like something that belonged to a different time, a different life. One night found her there. He had gotten up to get water and saw the small figure sitting in the darkness, her feet dangling above the floor, her hands resting in her lap. "What are you doing up?" he asked. Jumped startled. "I couldn't sleep." Walked over and sat down beside her on the bench. It was the first time he had sat there since the accident. The wood creaked softly beneath his weight. The keys gleamed in the dim light from the window. "Do you remember the song?" asked quietly. "The one you were playing that night?" His chest tightened. Of course he remembered. He remembered every note. It played in his head sometimes when he closed his eyes, beautiful and terrible at the same time. "I remember," he said. "Can you teach it to me?" The question hung in the air between them. Looked at his daughter, at her serious face and hopeful eyes, and felt something shift inside him. Something that had been frozen for a long time began to thaw. "My hand doesn't work anymore," he said. "I can't play." "But you can still teach," said. "You can show me which keys to press. You can tell me how it's supposed to sound." Stared at the piano. He thought about all the reasons to say no. The pain, the memories, the fear of facing something he had lost forever. Then he thought about his grandmother, teaching him on that old broken piano in her tiny apartment. She hadn't been a professional musician. She had never played on a stage, but she had given him something precious anyway. She had passed on a gift that had shaped his entire life. Maybe he could do the same. "Okay," he said, "I'll teach you." The lessons started slowly, just a few minutes at a time, late at night when the rest of the world was asleep. Would sit beside and guide her through the basics, pointing with his left hand, humming the melodies he wanted her to learn. His right hand stayed still in his lap, useless but no longer shameful. He was learning to accept it as part of who he was now. Was a natural. She had her father's ear for music, his instinct for rhythm and melody. Within weeks, she could play simple songs. Within months, she was working on pieces that had taken years to master. Watching her small fingers dance across the keys filled him with a pride he hadn't felt in a long time. Around the same time, something else began to change. Started paying attention to the news again. He read about other accidents, other disasters, other preventable tragedies caused by negligence and greed. He thought about the corroded gas line beneath the stage, the ignored warnings, the fake inspection reports. He thought about the 14 people who had died because someone decided that money mattered more than safety. And he got angry. It was a different kind of anger than he had felt before, not the bitter, inward anger that had consumed him for months. This was something outward, something purposeful. This was anger that wanted to do something, to change something, to make sure what happened to him didn't happen to anyone else. He started small. He wrote letters to local politicians, demanding stricter safety regulations for public events. He gave interviews to journalists, telling his story, putting a human face on a tragedy that had become just another statistic. He connected with other survivors, other families who had lost loved ones, and together they began to push for change. Then he did something bigger. With help from a lawyer who worked for free, established the Williams Foundation. He named it after his friend, the drummer who had pulled from the wreckage before the help arrived, had survived the explosion, but the experience had changed him. He had moved back to his to be closer to family, stepping away from music to heal in his own way. When called to ask permission to use his name, cried on the phone for 10 minutes before saying yes. The foundation had two missions. First, it provided support for survivors of disasters and their families, helping with medical bills, counseling, and the long process of rebuilding shattered lives. Second, it for stronger safety laws, pushing legislators to close the loopholes that had allowed the Riverside tragedy to happen. Within 2 years, the foundation had raised over $3 million. New legislation was passed requiring independent safety inspections for all major public events. Venue owners who ignored hazards faced criminal penalties. The changes wouldn't bring back the people who died, but they might save lives in the future. Found himself speaking at conferences, at memorials, at events he never could have imagined attending. He stood in front of crowds and told his story, not as a victim, but as a survivor. Not as someone defined by what he had lost, but as someone defined by what he chose to do next. 2 years after the explosion, stood on a stage again, not to play music, but to speak at the annual memorial for the Riverside victims. 14 empty chairs sat behind him, one for each person who didn't survive. Families filled the audience, some crying, some holding hands, all of them carrying wounds that would never fully heal. Sat in the front row with beside her. The little girl was 10 now, tall for her age, with her father's eyes and her mother's strength. She had brought a small keyboard with her, and when finished his speech, she walked up to join him on stage. Together, father and daughter sat down at the keyboard, placed his left hand gently on shoulder. She took a deep breath, placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The melody floated out into the silence, soft and sweet and full of hope. Sunday Morning Light, the song had written for, the song that was playing when the world fell apart. But this time, it wasn't about the tragedy. It was about what came after. It was about love that survives loss. It was about finding light in the darkness. It was about a little girl carrying forward something beautiful that her father thought he had lost forever. In the audience, Harold Vega closed his eyes and listened. Her scars hidden beneath her shirt wiped tears from her face. Williams nodded quietly from the back row, his hands folded in his lap. The music continued, filling the space, connecting everyone who heard it to everyone who couldn't be there anymore. Looked at his daughter, at her small hands moving with such grace, and felt his heart break and heal at the same time. He couldn't play anymore, but the music wasn't gone. It had just found a new way to live. And that, he realized, was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.